January 12, 1942. Somewhere over the gray waters of the western Pacific. The cockpit smelled of engine oil and sweat. Lieutenant Takeshi Harada pressed his gloved hand against the cold glass of his Mitsubishi A6M0, watching cloud formations part like silk curtains beneath him. The morning sun broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the fuselage. He had been flying for 3 hours now, navigating by instinct and the crude map folded in his lap, a map that showed coastlines and islands, but nothing of the invisible rivers of air through which he traveled. Below, the ocean stretched endless and indifferent. Above, the sky offered no answers. He was a samurai of the clouds, trained to endure, trained to sacrifice, trained to die with honor. But he was not trained for what he would see 4 months later, folded inside the leather satchel of a captured American pilot. In the winter of 1941, when the Empire of Japan struck Pearl Harbor with surgical precision, its naval aviators were considered the finest in the world. They had trained over the mountains of Manchuria, over the rice paddies of China, over the volcanic islands of the Pacific. They had learned to fly by feel, by the angle of the sun, by the color of the water. Their instructors taught them that navigation was an art, a communion between man and nature, a meditation between heaven and earth. Maps were simple, black ink on white paper, showing where land met sea, where cities sat along rivers. Weather was something you felt in your bones, read in the clouds, tasted in the wind. To ask for more was to admit weakness. To demand certainty was to dishonor the way of the warrior. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service did provide meteorological data, but it was sparse, often days old, gathered from scattered observation posts and fishing vessels radioing reports when they could. Pilots memorized seasonal wind patterns, learned to recognize the face of an approaching typhoon, understood that summer meant thunderstorms over the equator and winter brought clear skies to the northern latitudes. They carried basic charts showing magnetic headings and estimated distances. They calculated fuel consumption in their heads, adding margins for headwinds, subtracting time if the gods blessed them with favorable currents. It was enough. It had always been enough. The Empire had conquered Singapore, Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. Japanese pilots had flown thousands of miles across hostile territory and returned home. They were invincible. But invincibility, like all illusions, requires that you never see the truth. May 1942. The Solomon Islands. The air war in the Pacific had shifted. What began as a lightning campaign of conquest had slowed into a grinding contest of attrition. Japanese forces pushed south toward Australia, but for the first time they met resistance that did not collapse. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, American and Australian forces stopped a Japanese invasion fleet. It was the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never saw each other, all the fighting done by aircraft launched from carriers over the horizon. Pilots became the eyes, the fists, the sacrificial pawns in a game played across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Lieutenant Harada survived the Coral Sea engagement, though his squadron lost 6 Zeros and 3 dive bombers. He returned to Rabaul with a bullet hole in his left wing and a new understanding. The Americans were learning. Their Wildcat fighters were inferior to the Zero in speed and maneuverability, but they fought with a strange discipline, using altitude and teamwork instead of individual skill. Their bomber formations were precise, almost mechanical, and they always seemed to know where to be. It was in June, after the catastrophic defeat at Midway, where Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and the strategic initiative, that Harada first heard the rumors. Pilots returning from long-range patrols spoke in hushed tones about captured American aircraft, about documents found in wreckage, about maps that made no sense. Maps that showed things that should not be visible. Maps that predicted the future. He did not believe it until he saw one himself. The briefing room at Rabaul was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of mildew. The tropical heat made everything damp, turned paper soft, turned men irritable. Squadron leaders gathered around a battered table where a captured American navigation chart had been spread flat, held down at the corners by rice bowls and sake cups. The chart had been pulled from the wreckage of a Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber shot down near Guadalcanal. The American pilot had died in the crash, but his satchel survived, waterproofed and buckled tight. Harada pushed forward through the crowd of pilots. At first glance, the map looked ordinary. Blue ocean, green islands, black grid lines marking latitude and longitude. But then he noticed the annotations. Covering the entire chart, in neat printed English, were lines and numbers and symbols that transformed the ocean into something else entirely. Curved lines, isobars, though he did not know the word, traced invisible boundaries where air pressure rose and fell. Arrows showed wind direction and speed at different altitudes, updated weekly, sometimes daily. Shaded regions marked areas of expected turbulence. Dotted paths indicated optimal routes for different aircraft types, calculated for fuel efficiency and weather avoidance. In the margins, printed tables listed sunrise and sunset times, moonrise schedules, tidal data, radio frequencies for weather updates. The map did not just show where things were. It showed where the air itself was going. "This cannot be real," someone muttered in Japanese. "This would require hundreds of observers, thousands of reports." "It is real," replied the intelligence officer, a thin man with round spectacles. "We have captured 3 such maps now, from different American aircraft. All are updated regularly. All contain similar information." Harada stared at the chart, trying to comprehend the implications. The curved lines alone represented data gathered from a network that must span the entire Pacific. The wind speed arrows were updated with precision. 17 knots at 10,000 feet, shifting to 23 knots at 15,000 feet. The turbulence warnings included specific altitude ranges. The optimal routes were calculated with mathematical exactness, accounting for variables he had never considered quantifiable. "How do they gather this?" another pilot asked. The intelligence officer shook his head. "We do not fully understand. We believe they have weather reconnaissance aircraft that fly daily patterns, ships that report conditions, perhaps listening stations on remote islands. But the scale of it—" He trailed off, adjusting his spectacles. "The scale of it suggests something we have not anticipated." Harada reached out and touched the map, his finger tracing one of the curved pressure lines. The paper was thick, durable, laminated with some kind of plastic coating that made it waterproof. Even the physical quality of the document spoke of resources beyond imagination. In his own pocket, he carried a map printed on thin rice paper that dissolved if it got wet, that tore easily, that had to be replaced every few missions because the tropical humidity destroyed it. "Why would they need this?" someone asked. "Their pilots are inferior to ours. They lack spirit." The room fell silent. It was a question no one wanted to answer, because the answer undermined everything they had been taught. If American pilots were inferior, if they lacked the warrior spirit that made Japanese aviators supreme, then why were they winning? Why had Midway ended in disaster? Why were the supply lines to Guadalcanal being cut with increasing frequency? Harada understood, though he did not speak it aloud. The Americans did not need to be better pilots. They needed to be more efficient. These maps, these impossible, meticulous, constantly updated maps, they removed uncertainty. They turned navigation from an art into a science, from a test of spirit into a simple calculation. An American pilot did not need to read the clouds or feel the wind. He simply followed the printed route, adjusted for the predicted conditions, and arrived at his destination with fuel to spare. He did not need courage to face the unknown, because the unknown had been measured, quantified, and printed on waterproof paper. It was not that the Americans were better warriors. It was that they had made warriorhood irrelevant. In the months that followed, as Japanese forces dug in across the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, the maps became a recurring obsession among the pilots. Every captured aircraft yielded more evidence of the vast meteorological apparatus supporting American operations. Some maps included forecasts, actual predictions of weather conditions 3 days, 5 days, even a week in advance. Others showed seasonal patterns, historical data, statistical probabilities of storm formation. One particularly detailed chart, recovered from a downed B-17 Flying Fortress, included a handwritten note in the margin: Route B recommended for fuel conservation. Route A if weather forecast holds. The American pilot had choices. He could optimize for speed or safety or fuel economy, all based on information that was simply provided to him, printed and distributed as routinely as ammunition. Japanese pilots had no such choices. They flew the routes they were ordered to fly, and if the weather turned against them, they endured. If headwinds consumed their fuel, they ditched in the ocean and hoped for rescue. If clouds obscured their navigation points, they dead-reckoned and prayed to ancestors for guidance. Skill and spirit could overcome many obstacles, but they could not overcome ignorance. Lieutenant Harada began keeping a personal diary, a violation of regulations but a private necessity. In it, he recorded his observations, trying to understand what the maps revealed about America itself. "The enemy does not trust individual judgment," he wrote one night by candlelight. "They replace the warrior's intuition with printed instructions. Is this strength or weakness? I do not know. But I know this: they do not lose pilots to navigation errors. They do not run out of fuel because of unexpected headwinds. They do not arrive at battle exhausted from fighting the weather. They save their strength for fighting us." The symbolic power of the maps extended beyond their practical utility. They represented a philosophical divide that ran deeper than politics or military strategy. Japan's military culture, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, emphasized personal mastery, spiritual discipline, and acceptance of hardship. Suffering was not something to be eliminated but to be embraced, transformed into strength through willpower. A pilot who could navigate by instinct, who could endure cold and hunger and fear without complaint, who could fly his aircraft to destruction if duty demanded, this was the ideal. Tools and technology were useful, but they were subordinate to the human spirit. America's culture, as revealed through these maps, seemed to operate on different principles entirely. Suffering was not noble, it was inefficient. Hardship was not a test of character, it was a problem to be solved. The American military did not ask its pilots to navigate by instinct when instruments could navigate for them. It did not ask them to endure uncertainty when information could eliminate it. It did not glorify sacrifice when planning and resources could reduce the need for sacrifice. The maps were not just tools. They were a statement of values: that knowledge was better than ignorance, that preparation was better than improvisation, that abundance was better than scarcity. For pilots like Harada, raised in a culture that revered austerity and self-denial, this was profoundly disturbing. It suggested that all their training, all their discipline, all their spiritual preparation might be merely insufficient. Not because they lacked courage, but because courage alone could not compete with an enemy that had systematized the removal of obstacles. As intelligence officers pieced together information from captured documents, interrogated prisoners, and analyzed American radio traffic, a picture emerged of the vast apparatus that produced these maps. The United States Weather Bureau, working in coordination with the Army, Air Forces, and Navy, had established a network of weather stations stretching across the Pacific. These stations, some on islands, some on ships, some operating secretly behind enemy lines, transmitted hourly observations via radio. The data flowed to central collection points in Hawaii, Australia, and California, where meteorologists compiled it into forecasts and printed updated charts. But the system went further. The Americans had developed specialized aircraft, Douglas C-47 Skytrans and Boeing B-17s modified for weather reconnaissance, that flew scheduled patterns through regions where no ground stations existed. These weather planes carried instruments that measured temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed at various altitudes. They radioed their findings back in coded transmissions. The data was analyzed, synthesized with other observations, and used to create predictive models of atmospheric behavior. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their weather service was adequate for civilian purposes, providing basic forecasts for farmers and fishermen, but the military had never prioritized meteorological infrastructure. Japan was an island nation with limited resources, fighting a war across an ocean that stretched 8,000 miles. Every ton of cargo space on a ship, every flight hour for an aircraft, had to be justified against immediate tactical needs. Weather stations were a luxury. Weather reconnaissance planes were an absurdity. Pilots were expected to adapt to conditions, not to have conditions predicted for them. The Americans, by contrast, had built their meteorological network before the war even started. They had invested in it the way they invested in radar, in proximity fuses, in cryptography, treating information itself as a strategic resource. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the infrastructure was already in place, already gathering data, already refining techniques. The war simply expanded and accelerated a process that had been underway for years. This realization, that the maps were not a wartime improvisation but the product of long-term institutional thinking, was perhaps the most demoralizing aspect for Japanese aviators. It meant that America had been preparing for a different kind of war, a war of systems and logistics and accumulated advantage, while Japan had been preparing for a war of spirit and sacrifice and dramatic gestures. Both approaches could win battles, but only one could win a protracted conflict across half the planet. Lieutenant Harada wrote in his diary, "We were taught that material wealth makes men soft, that abundance breeds weakness. But what if abundance is not a weakness? What if it is simply another form of strength, one we do not understand? The Americans waste nothing because they have so much that waste is irrelevant. They print maps by the thousands because paper costs nothing to them. They fly weather planes every day because fuel is plentiful. They replace lost aircraft faster than we can shoot them down. We call this decadence, but perhaps we are deceiving ourselves. Perhaps we are the ones who are weak because we cannot imagine a world of plenty." By late 1943, the maps had become emblematic of a larger unraveling. Japan's defensive perimeter was contracting. Island after island fell to American amphibious assaults supported by overwhelming air superiority. Japanese pilots, even the most skilled, found themselves outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmaneuvered. The Zeros that had once dominated the Pacific skies were now facing new American fighters, Hellcats and Corsairs, that combined speed, armor, and firepower in ways that negated Japanese advantages in agility. Harada, now a captain and squadron leader, noticed changes in the men under his command. The young pilots arriving as replacements lacked the years of training that his generation had received. They were rushed through abbreviated courses, taught the basics of flight but not the refinements of combat. They died quickly, often on their first or second mission, shot down by American pilots who had been trained in similar abbreviated programs but who benefited from better aircraft, better tactics, and yes, better maps. One evening, after losing 3 pilots in a single afternoon to a well-coordinated American ambush, Harada found himself studying another captured map. This one was even more detailed than the first he had seen, annotated with red ink showing Japanese air patrol patterns, known anti-aircraft positions, radar coverage gaps. The Americans were not just predicting the weather. They were predicting Japanese behavior, turning the enemy itself into another variable to be mapped and calculated. He thought about the young pilot who had died that morning, a boy of 19 who had trained for 6 months and flew with more enthusiasm than skill. The boy had been shot down over Bougainville, his Zero disintegrating in a ball of fire before he could even radio a distress call. What map had the American pilot been following? What weather forecast had ensured he arrived at the right altitude, at the right time, with the sun at his back and the fuel to press the attack? The maps, Harada realized, were not just about weather. They were about control. Control over nature, over chance, over the fundamental uncertainties that had always defined warfare. The samurai tradition taught that a warrior must accept death, must embrace the randomness of battle, must find peace in the chaos. But what if the enemy refused to accept chaos? What if they systematically eliminated randomness, turning war into a problem of engineering and logistics? If there was a single material that encapsulated the difference between Japan and America, it was paper. Simple, mundane, essential paper. The maps that Japanese pilots captured were printed on thick, coated stock that resisted water, tearing, and degradation. They could be folded and unfolded hundreds of times without falling apart. They were produced in such quantities that pilots discarded old versions and replaced them with updated editions weekly. Some American aircraft carried multiple copies of the same map, backups in case one was damaged. Japanese maps, by contrast, were printed on whatever paper was available, often thin, low-quality stock that yellowed and crumbled in the tropical climate. They were printed sparingly, reused until they were illegible, repaired with paste and rice glue. Pilots treated them as precious objects because they were irreplaceable. To lose your map was a serious offense, potentially a court-martial matter. But paper was just the visible symptom of a deeper disparity. America could print maps by the millions because it had paper mills that ran continuously, fed by forests that seemed inexhaustible, powered by electrical grids that never failed. It had printing presses by the thousands, ink by the barrel, trained workers by the tens of thousands. The infrastructure to produce maps was the same infrastructure that produced newspapers, magazines, books, packaging, office documents, a civilian economy that had been converted to military purposes but that retained its essential character of abundance. Japan, meanwhile, was running out of everything. Oil for fuel, metal for aircraft, rubber for tires, and yes, paper for maps. The home islands had few forests, and those that existed were needed for construction timber. Paper production had always been modest, and the war had diverted resources to more critical needs. By 1944, Japanese pilots were being issued maps printed on paper so thin it was almost translucent, maps that sometimes arrived with notes apologizing for the poor quality and instructing users to handle them carefully. The irony was bitter. Japan had gone to war, in part, to secure resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was supposed to create a self-sufficient economic bloc that could rival the industrial might of America and Europe. But 3 years into the war, Japan was more resource-starved than ever, while America, protected by oceans and blessed with continental resources, was producing materials at a rate that seemed almost supernatural. Lieutenant, now Captain, Harada kept a piece of captured American map paper in his breast pocket, folded into a small square. He carried it not as a souvenir but as a talisman, a reminder of what he was fighting against. Sometimes, during long flights, he would take it out and feel the texture between his fingers. Smooth, durable, confident. It did not tear easily. It did not absorb moisture. It was engineered to survive anything except fire. Even the paper, he thought, was designed with the assumption of abundance. The Americans could afford to make their maps nearly indestructible because they could always make more. The psychological impact of the maps spread beyond individual pilots to the broader military culture. In strategy meetings, in training lectures, in private conversations, the question arose again and again. How do we counter an enemy that has removed chance from the equation? Japanese doctrine emphasized surprise, aggression, and moral superiority. But surprise was difficult when the enemy's reconnaissance was so thorough. Aggression was costly when the enemy could predict your movements and position forces accordingly. And moral superiority, the belief that Japanese spirit could overcome material disadvantage, was hard to maintain when young pilots kept dying in predictable patterns. Some officers doubled down on traditional values. They argued that the maps were evidence of American weakness, that reliance on technology made them brittle, that a truly determined attack would shatter their carefully planned systems. They pointed to kamikaze tactics as the ultimate expression of Japanese spirit, pilots who needed no maps because they were not coming back, who required only enough fuel to reach the target, who transformed themselves into weapons that no amount of planning could fully defend against. Other officers, quieter and less influential, began to question whether Japan had made fundamental strategic errors. They wondered if the war had been winnable at all, given the disparity in industrial capacity. They looked at the maps and saw not just weather data but the outlines of an economic system so productive, so efficient, so wasteful in its abundance that it could treat paper and ink and human time as essentially free. How do you defeat an enemy that can afford to be meticulous? Captain Harada fell somewhere between these positions. He did not believe that spirit was useless. He had seen too many examples of courage making the difference in close combat. But he also could not deny that spirit alone was insufficient. The Americans were not cowards. Their pilots, initially clumsy and poorly coordinated, had learned and adapted. They fought with a kind of methodical determination that was, in its own way, as impressive as Japanese ferocity. They simply fought differently, using tools and information and coordinated systems in place of individual heroics. In his diary, he wrote, "I have come to understand that there are two kinds of strength in this world. The strength of the individual, perfected through discipline and sacrifice, and the strength of the collective, perfected through organization and abundance. We believed the first was superior to the second. But what if they are simply different? What if the Americans have discovered a way to make average men perform at the level of exceptional men by giving them exceptional tools? We train our pilots for years to navigate by instinct. They train their pilots for months to navigate by map. Both arrive at the same destination, but they arrive with different resources remaining, different capacities to fight when they get there." April 1945. The sky above Okinawa. The war had come to Japan's doorstep. Okinawa, the southern island prefecture, was under assault by the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled in the Pacific. American ships blackened the horizon. American aircraft filled the skies in formations so dense they looked like migratory swarms. And still, Japanese pilots flew out to meet them, wave after wave, many on one-way missions with no expectation of return. Captain Harada had survived longer than most. He had flown over 100 combat missions, had shot down 11 confirmed enemy aircraft, had been shot down twice himself and rescued from the ocean both times. He was 31 years old, ancient by the standards of the air war, and he commanded a squadron of teenagers who called him Old Man, with a mixture of respect and pity. On the morning of April 16th, he led a formation of 6 Zeros on an intercept mission against a reported American bomber formation. The intelligence was vague. Somewhere north of Okinawa, altitude unknown, composition uncertain. They climbed through patchy clouds, searching, fuel gauges already showing the mission was a gamble. If they did not find the enemy soon, they would not have enough fuel to return. They found them at 14,000 feet. Not bombers, but fighters, a dozen Hellcats flying in precise formation, maintaining altitude and spacing with mechanical discipline. The Americans saw the Zeros approaching and immediately shifted into defensive posture, pairs covering each other, altitude advantage secured. Harada knew it was a trap. The fighters were bait, and somewhere nearby, perhaps above, perhaps behind, there would be more. But orders were to engage, and fuel was low, and there were no good choices. He rolled into an attack, his 5 wingmen following, and for 3 minutes the sky became a whirling chaos of tracer rounds and burning fuel and shouted radio warnings. He shot one Hellcat off his wingman's tail, saw it fall away trailing smoke. Then something hit his Zero from behind, a burst of 50 caliber rounds that punched through the thin armor plating and shattered instruments. The engine coughed, lost power, caught again. Fuel was streaming from a punctured tank. He was 50 miles from base, losing altitude, and the Americans were not pursuing. They had reformed and were heading east, toward Okinawa, their mission undisturbed by the brief skirmish. He nursed his dying aircraft back toward Kyushu, watching the fuel gauge drop to 0, knowing he would have to ditch in the ocean or bail out before reaching land. Below, the Pacific glittered in the afternoon sun, indifferent as always. He thought about the American pilots in their Hellcats, flying back to their carrier with updated maps showing wind patterns, weather forecasts, optimal approach vectors. They would land safely, eat a hot meal, sleep in bunks, and fly again tomorrow. Their maps had brought them here efficiently, would guide them back efficiently, would send them out again and again until either they died or the war ended. He did not make it back. The engine seized 30 miles from shore, and he ditched in the shallows near a small island. Local fishermen pulled him from the wreckage, bruised and concussed but alive. By the time he was recovered and returned to his unit, the war was in its final weeks. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs ended the war in a flash of fire that no amount of spirit or sacrifice could withstand. Japan surrendered, and the maps, the mundane, meticulous, constantly updated maps, became artifacts of a conflict that had been decided as much by logistics and information as by battles and bloodshed. Captain Harada survived the war. He was 31 years old, unemployed, living in a country that had been reduced to rubble. He kept his diary, and in it he kept the small square of American map paper that he had carried through dozens of missions. Sometimes he would take it out and look at it, remembering the day he first understood what it represented. Years later, in the 1950s, as Japan began its reconstruction under American occupation, he would see the same principles at work. The Americans arrived with plans, with blueprints, with schedules and budgets and projections. They built infrastructure with the same methodical efficiency that they had built their weather network, sewage systems, electrical grids, highways, ports. They did not rely on improvisation or heroic individual effort. They calculated, measured, planned, and executed. And it worked. Japan rose from the ashes not through samurai spirit but through borrowed American systems of organization and abundance. Harada thought often about the maps. He came to see them not as mere tools of war but as expressions of a worldview. The Americans had gone to war believing that knowledge was power, that information could be gathered and systematized and distributed, that uncertainty was not a test of character but an enemy to be defeated. They had built institutions, weather services, intelligence agencies, logistics networks, that treated data as a strategic resource equal to oil or steel. And those institutions had won. Japan had gone to war believing that spirit was power, that discipline and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantage, that the warrior's path was superior to the merchant's ledger. It was a beautiful belief, rooted in centuries of tradition, expressed in poetry and art and honor codes that made life meaningful. But it was not enough. It had never been enough. The maps proved that. In his old age, Harada would sometimes give talks to students, when asked about his experiences. He would tell them about the zero, about the battles, about the comrades who never came home. And he would tell them about the maps. "We thought they were weak because they needed so much," he would say. "But they were strong because they could provide so much. We thought we were strong because we needed so little. But needing little is only a virtue if you have a choice. We had no choice. They did. That was the difference." The maps, in the end, were not about weather. They were about a nation that could afford to care about weather, that could dedicate resources to knowing what the wind would do tomorrow, that could print that knowledge on durable paper and distribute it to every pilot as casually as ammunition. They were about an empire built not on conquest and domination, but on production and distribution, on the quiet confidence that comes from having more than enough. And they were a reminder, carried in the breast pocket of a pilot who had learned too late, that in the arithmetic of modern war, abundance defeats austerity. Information defeats ignorance. And the future belongs to those who plan for it, measure it, print it on waterproof paper, and hand it to young men with instructions to come home alive. The maps showed the weather, but they revealed the world.